The question of what was sex really like in Viking times, and more, does not lead us to silk-draped chambers or private alcoves, but to the glow of a single fire in a crowded longhouse. Here, in the heart of the settlement, Viking men, women, children, and even animals shared the same smoky air. The hearth was life itself, and the hall was the world. Intimacy was not whispered behind closed doors. It unfolded in the shadows of a communal bed of straw, beneath furs heavy with the scent of smoke, sweat, and the day's food. A Viking couple seeking closeness had no lock, no chamber, no curtain to guard their moment. Privacy was a luxury unknown, and desire had to bend to the rhythms of the household. At night, the long fire burned low, embers casting light across beams blackened by years of smoke. Families lay side by side, children murmuring in sleep, old kin wrapped in blankets, goats shifting in their pen at the far end. Lovers whispered not for romance, but for secrecy, hoping their movements would be lost to the crackle of the flames. To love in such a space demanded courage, cunning, and above all, silence. Even among chieftains, who boasted larger halls, the presence of servants was constant. A Viking thrall might lie at the edge of the bedding platform, pretending to slumber, ears open to every sigh. Guests might linger in corners, drinking horn still in hand, their eyes deliberately averted. Yet such pretense did little to soften the truth. Viking intimacy was often witnessed, overheard, or guessed at. It was survival, not softness, that defined the act, born from the knowledge that tomorrow might bring storm, sword, or hunger. For those who travelled, the strangeness deepened. Inns and hostels offered shared benches and shared beds, where a Viking man might lie beside a stranger, his wife or lover pressed close between them, while boots and weapons clattered at their feet. Desire did not wait for comfort. It adapted, daring to exist where no walls kept watch. And yet, out of these crowded hearths and communal furs came the sons and daughters who carved runes into stone, who rowed the longships, who carried the Viking name across oceans. So when we ask what passion meant in those halls, the answer is simple and fierce. It was not luxury, nor gentle indulgence, but a flame kindled against the press of the world. Amid the snoring of kin, the shuffle of livestock, and the ever-watchful gossip of neighbours, Viking love persisted. It was raw, unhidden, and bound as tightly to survival as bread, mead, and the fire itself. Love and law walked hand in hand in the north, but often it was the law that led, dragging love behind it like a weary ox on a rope. To ask what was sex really like in Viking times and more is to look first at how a union was bound, not by whispered desire, but by the striking of oaths and the clink of silver. A Viking marriage was never just two hearts finding each other. It was a bond between families, a treaty of land, cattle, and honour. When a Viking man sought a bride, he did not begin with song or flowers, but with negotiations at the long table, where kin argued terms while the hearth smoke curled thick above them. A dowry was no small thing. It might be measured in arm rings of silver, hacked to weight, in Viking tools of iron, in bolts of fine cloth, or in a patch of farmland that could feed hungry mouths. Alongside it came the munda, the bride price, paid by the groom's family to seal the pact. These were not gifts of sentiment, but pledges of stability, ensuring that the joining of two bodies also secured the joining of two lineages. Behind every kiss stood the weight of inheritance, every embrace shadowed by the keen eyes of kin who counted what was gained or lost. Passion was not banished, but it bowed to custom. A Viking woman's hand was rarely hers alone to give. Fathers, brothers, and uncles measured her worth in alliances. Her marriage could end a feud, secure a trade route, or bind neighbours against raiders. Yet, within these iron chains of law, sparks of choice still flickered. A woman of strong standing could refuse a match, and sagas tell of Viking brides who demanded fair terms or wielded wit like a sword to shape their fate. Still, the hall heard more bargains than ballads. On the wedding day, when ale foamed and Viking food filled the boards, the union was blessed before gods and men alike. Oaths were spoken. The bride led to her groom's bed, often with a sword laid between them to mark the solemn shift from maiden to wife. The moment of joining was sacred not only for the flesh, but for the fate it carried new heirs, new ties, new strands in the web of kinship. Thus, Viking love was a matter of contracts inked not in parchment, but in bloodlines. Where others might think of tenderness, the Norse thought of cattle, coin, and the strength of an oath. And yet, beneath the sternness of law, the human heart still beat. Couples sometimes found true fondness in the lives they built, side by side, tending land and raising Viking children. Love grew slowly, like fire coaxed from damp wood, but when it caught, it burned with the same wild heat that drove their ships across the seas. In the north, where the wind carved stone and men carved runes, even love was bound by law. To ask what was sex really like in Viking times and more is to reckon with the strange balance between passion and permission, for the Vikings demanded that a marriage be spoken into truth by the will of both bride and groom. In an age when daughters elsewhere were bartered like cattle, Viking law carved a sharper line. A union was no union without the word yes, yet this consent, though honoured in law, was seldom free of chains, for family honour, property, and bloodline weighed heavy on every choice. A Viking father could not simply thrust his daughter into another man's bed without her voice. The sagas tell us that her word had power, that the law itself recognized her refusal. But what is freedom when a hall full of kinsmen watches, when a Viking mother warns of famine, when brothers whisper of alliances and cattle? The girl's answer might be hers to speak, yet the echo belonged to the clan. Many a maiden nodded with downcast eyes, caught between her heart and her duty, her consent wrapped in silence as binding as any vow. For a Viking man, the right to wed was also bound to law. He could not seize a bride by sword without consequence, for abduction and forced bedding stirred feuds that burned for generations. Instead, he sought the approval of her kin, bringing gifts and oaths, proving his worth in wealth and in standing. Consent was not whispered in dark corners, but declared before witnesses, carved into memory like runes on stone. It was a ritual of voices, not just two, but many, binding households together in one fate. Still, the law left room for rebellion. Sagas speak of women who defied fathers, who declared their refusal with sharp tongues and sharper wills, breaking betrothals, even at the cost of disgrace. Others fled in secret, choosing love over law, their names remembered because such defiance was rare and dangerous. Consent in Viking lands was both shield and snare, offering protection against the worst of coercion, yet twisting under the weight of politics until the bride's yes was shaped as much by duty as by desire. And when the vows were sealed, when the dowry was settled and the feast consumed, the law's role did not end. If the bride later claimed she had been forced, if the groom denied her rights, the court could be called, witnesses summoned, fines laid heavy on dishonoured men. Viking law was no soft guardian, but it knew that the joining of man and woman was too sacred, too dangerous, to leave without order. In the crackle of the hearth and the echo of oaths, love was not just flesh and fire, it was consent forged by word, bound by law, and remembered in saga. In the Viking world, no maiden's fate was hers alone. To wonder what was sex really like in Viking times and more is to first understand how matches were made. For love did not grow freely like wildflowers in the field it was planted, tended, and guarded by kin. A Viking daughter was the pride of her household, her worth measured not only by beauty or skill, but by the alliances her hand could forge. Fathers, mothers, uncles, and even distant kin all had a say, for her marriage was not just a union of flesh, but a bond of land, wealth, and honour. When talk of marriage arose, it was rarely whispered between two hearts. Instead, It thundered across the benches of the longhouse. Families gathered, horns of mead were raised, and go-betweens, trusted men who carried words between households, spoke on behalf of suitors. These emissaries carried not only offers of dowry and bride price, but oaths of loyalty, promises of peace, and sometimes veiled threats. A Viking man who sought a wife dared not simply appear at her door. He came through the proper channels, for to bypass the family was to court feud and bloodshed. For the maiden, her role was both central and shadowed. She could not be tossed like spoils. Her word was needed, her nod required by law. Yet those nods were often pressed from her lips by duty. A Viking maiden might feel her heart stir for a bold youth at the market, or a fellow singer at the feast, but the choice of her kin weighed heavier. She was watched closely, guarded not just by parents, but by the whole community. A flirtatious glance, a stolen walk at dusk, even the brush of a hand could spark gossip that reached the ears of fathers before the night was done. Mothers, aunts, and older women played their part as well, whispering counsel, watching for suitors who might bring honour or shame. They weighed not only land and wealth, but the steadiness of the man's hand, the sharpness of his sword, and whether he could provide Viking food and shelter through harsh winters. Some maidens pressed for better terms, and sagas recall fierce-tongued women who refused matches unworthy of their name. Others obeyed quietly, trusting that affection might grow after the bedding, as many said it did. Thus, matchmaking in the north was less a dance of hearts and more a weaving of fate. Each strand of family, wealth, and honour was drawn tight until two lives were bound. The maiden's body was not hers alone, but a vessel through which kinship and future were secured. And yet, beneath the stern eyes of fathers and the sharp ears of mothers, sparks of true desire still smouldered. For all the bargaining and watchful kin, Viking men and Viking women still found ways to kindle warmth in cold halls, and from such guarded unions, generations were born who carried the North across the seas. The Viking wedding night was no quiet. Slipping away into shadows, it was the thunderous climax of a day bound in ale, oaths, and sacred ritual. To ask what was sex really like in Viking times and more is to look closely at this moment, when law, kinship, and desire finally met beneath one roof. The feast had roared for hours, horns clashing as mead spilled, Viking men boasting of battles, Viking women trading sharp words and laughter, Viking food heaped high upon the boards. Yet all the noise, all the smoke, all the song pointed toward a single moment. The bedding of bride and groom. No wedding was complete without it. When the night deepened and the fire burned low, the couple was led to their chamber, or more often, to a bed within the hall itself. Sometimes the whole company followed, torchlight casting long shadows, as kin escorted the pair with ceremony both solemn and raucous. In some traditions, a sword was laid between them on the bed, a cold line of steel symbolizing both chastity preserved and the transfer of guardianship from father to husband. The blade reminded all that marriage was not merely passion, but the forging of bloodlines, defended as fiercely as land or treasure. The hall did not fall silent. Guests lingered, ears keen, some chanting blessings, others singing bawdy verses meant to stir luck and fertility. Privacy was a scarce thing in the Viking world, and even on this night, intimacy unfolded beneath watchful eyes, or at least knowing ears. Yet there was reverence woven through the jesting. This act was not only flesh, it was sacred, a joining that would bind families, ensure heirs, and honour the gods of fertility, Freya and Freya. For the bride, it was a crossing. She had walked from her father's hall into her husband's, her dowry settled, her consent given, and now her body became part of the pact. For the groom, it was both triumph and burden, for the law demanded not only passion, but proof of virility, a seal upon the union. Tomorrow, whispers would rise. Was the marriage consummated? Did the bedding prove fruitful? A single night's silence could spark doubts, disputes, even feud. And so the Viking wedding night carried weight beyond desire. It was the hinge upon which families turned, the spark from which children, inheritance, and the next saga would come. Yet within all the ritual and expectation, there was still room for warmth. A hand clasped beneath furs, the exchange of whispers unheard by kin, the shy smile of a bride, the steady gaze of her groom. These were the human truths hidden beneath the roar of custom. For all the ale and swords, for all the eyes and laughter, when the fire dimmed and the night grew deep, the wedding bed was theirs alone. In a world of crowded halls and ever-watchful kin, true privacy was a treasure rarer than silver. To ask what was sex really like in Viking times, and more, is to glimpse those stolen instants when desire broke free from law and duty. A Viking man and his bride did not always wait for the solemnity of the feast or the blessing of kin. Beneath the constant murmur of daily life, there pulsed hidden moments, snatched by hearthfire, stolen in fields, whispered on the rolling decks of a longship. At night, when the longhouse quieted and the embers glowed faint red, lovers might inch closer beneath shared furs. The hall was full. Viking children slept near their parents. Viking thralls stirred softly in corners. Goats shifted in the straw, but love was cunning. A hand slid into the dark. A whisper softened beneath the crackle of wood. A glance held longer than custom allowed. The world did not grant them walls, so they built their own, with silence and the daring of hearts unwilling to be bound. By day, fields became sanctuaries, a maiden fetching water, a husband checking fences, a wife tending flax. Such errands gave the perfect cloak. There, among the tall grass and the whisper of wind, passion bloomed beyond the sight of mothers and the ears of priests. The sagas hint at such meetings, careful but fiery, where desire carried more danger than any blade. To be discovered was to court gossip, fines, even feud. Yet risk itself stoked the fire, and many a Viking tale remembers not the lawful union, but the forbidden tryst hidden beneath the summer Sunday. On voyages, desire took a different shape. The sea offered no curtains, only the endless horizon, the creak of timber, and the closeness of bodies confined together. A Viking woman, rare aboard but not unknown, might find herself drawn to the man beside her at the oars, the one whose back bent in rhythm with the waves. In the stillness between storms, when the ship rocked gently under stars, there was time for whispers, for touches, for brief unions hurried beneath cloaks. Sailors lived with death at their shoulder. Each night could be their last, and so they seized what comfort they could. Hidden moments were never small. They were fierce, defiant, carved into memory with the same intensity as raids and feasts. They remind us that Viking passion was not only law-bound, not only measured by contracts and dowries. It was alive in the quiet corners, in stolen laughter, in breathless embraces by the fire. For all the weight of kinship and the watchful eyes of community, Viking lovers found their way, and when they did, it was not meek but blazing, as raw and untamed as the northern seas themselves. Desire in the Viking world was not always hidden in shadows or pressed beneath furs. It often leapt boldly into words. To ask what was sex really like in Viking times and more is to listen to the songs and verses that carried longing, jest, and shameless fire across the smoky halls. The skalds, those masters of word and rhythm, wove more than praise for kings and tales of battle. They spun riddles thick with double meanings, verses that could redden a maiden's cheek or draw laughter from a circle of hardened Viking men. These songs of desire were never gentle court whispers alone. They were sharp, clever, sometimes crude, but always alive. A Viking skald might craft a verse comparing a woman's beauty to the glow of embers, her lips to mead sweeter than any cask. Yet in the next breath he could turn to mischief, twisting metaphors into bawdy jokes that spoke of bodies, heat, and hunger. Viking poetry was as bold as their ships. It sailed straight into the storm without apology. Around the fire, riddles carried this spirit too. To the unknowing ear, they spoke of farming tools, of ships, of the weaving of cloth. But to those listening with sharper minds, the hidden meanings revealed themselves. A plough might be more than a plough, a loom more than thread and shuttle. The laughter that followed was not scornful but delighted, a shared recognition of wit and desire hidden in plain sight. Viking women were no strangers to this game. Many sagas tell of women answering back with riddles sharper than the men's, their clever words a shield as well as a lure. For a people so often remembered for steel and storm, these songs reveal another truth. Vikings were not only warriors and farmers, but lovers of words, weaving their passion into sagas as much as into their embraces. A Viking man could win honour in battle, but he could also win a maiden's heart or her ridicule through the strength of his tongue, not his sword. Such verses carried power. A well-aimed poem could seduce, shame, or even curse. Some men were outlawed for speaking too boldly of women not their own, their words considered as dangerous as blades. Yet, this danger only added weight to the practice. To sing desire was to court risk, to reveal hunger before the whole hall. It was not hidden in secrecy, but blazoned in rhythm and rhyme, daring others to laugh, to blush, or to answer back. And so, when the night was deep and the fire cast shadows on the hall beams, songs of desire rose with the smoke. They were the breath of human longing, fierce and unashamed, as much a part of Viking life as the clash of axes or the sharing of Viking food. In verse and riddle, passion was not only lived but sung, echoing through halls where wit and want danced as one. When the cross first cast its shadow across the north, it fell not only upon the temples of the gods, but into the bedchambers of men and women. To ask what was sex really like in Viking times, and more, is to see how the clash between old ways and the new faith reshaped desire itself. For centuries, the Vikings had honoured Freya and Freyja, gods of fertility and passion, offering sacrifice for fruitful fields and strong heirs. Their world knew no shame in flesh, no sin in feasting, or in love, but the church arrived with stern eyes, carrying parchments and sermons, and what had once been sacred was suddenly declared sinful. Priests spoke with iron tongues, condemning the very acts that gave life to kin and saga. The joys of the bed were no longer blessings from the gods, but traps of the devil. A Viking man, who once boasted openly of conquests, was told to whisper his sins in the cold silence of confession. A Viking woman, whose body had been revered as a vessel of fertility, was now warned to cover herself, her passion treated as temptation. The clash was more than ritual, it was a war for the soul of desire. Confession became the sharpest blade of the new order. Priests demanded details, probing not only the heart, but the flesh. Husbands and wives, once free to embrace as they pleased, were pressed with questions. When? How? On what day of the holy calendar? The intimacy of the hall was dragged before the altar. The church set rules upon rules: no union on Sundays, none on feast days, none during Lent or Advent. To the Norse ear, it seemed half the year was forbidden, the other half shadowed with guilt. And yet, the Viking spirit did not bend easily. Many nodded at the priest by day, then returned to their halls by night to live as they always had, sharing furs, raising Viking children, and feasting without shame. The old gods still lingered in whispers, in charms tucked beneath bedding, in songs sung low by the fire. Even as the cross spread, Freya's name was called in secret, for no priest could strip desire from the marrow of the people. Still, the church gained ground. The halls of kings turned to stone churches, and young Viking boys learned prayers where once they learned sagas. Slowly, shame crept where there had been boldness. Lovers glanced over shoulders, women bore the burden of chastity, and men who once sang bawdy verses now bit their tongues. Yet beneath it all, the blood of the North still pulsed. Passion did not die, it adapted, hidden in silence, waiting in shadows, or bound in marriage as the priests demanded. The arrival of the church did not end Viking desire. It chained it, masked it, wrapped it in ritual and guilt. But the old fire burned on, fierce and unrepentant, in the hearts of a people who had never been taught to bow quietly. Fertility in the Viking world was no small matter. It was the hinge upon which survival turned. To ask what was sex really like in Viking times and more is to understand that passion was never only pleasure. It was the lifeblood of clans, the promise of heirs to till the earth, wield the sword, and keep the fire burning when winter pressed hard. And with such weight came both reverence and fear, for the line between blessing and barrenness was thin, and the gods themselves held it in their hands. Freya, radiant goddess of love, was called upon in hushed prayers, her name whispered into the dark when a Viking woman longed for a child. She was not only the mistress of beauty and desire, but the bringer of fruitfulness to wombs and fields alike. Freya, her brother, stood as her equal, a god of virility whose power was as visible in the ploughed soil as in the strong arms of a Viking man. Together, they embodied the sacred fire of union, and rituals were woven around them to draw down their favour. Couples sought charms to guide conception. Amulets carved with runes were tied about the bedposts, bones of beasts were buried at thresholds, and herbs gathered under moonlight were brewed into strange, potent draughts. Some Viking women carried apple branches or wore necklaces of amber, believing their glow would open the path to motherhood. A Viking man might sacrifice a boar to Freya, staining the earth red with blood, a plea for strength in himself and the harvest alike. To those who farmed, the fertility of body and soil were one and the same. Barren land meant empty bellies, barren wombs meant empty halls. But with hope came dread. A woman who bore no child carried a heavy shadow, whispered about by kin, pitied or feared. Was she cursed? Had she angered the gods? Some sought Seither, the magic of prophecy and transformation, though men who practiced it risked mockery and ruin. Fear of infertility lingered like smoke in the rafters, and families grasped at every ritual that might tip fate toward blessing. Even the act of love itself was thought to carry weight. The right season, the right moon, the right offering placed in secret before the bed could mean the difference between life and despair. Fertility was sacred, but it was also fragile. Every child born was a victory, a sign that the gods had smiled once more. In this balance of hope and fear, Viking passion was not idle indulgence, it was prayer made flesh, a desperate reaching toward the divine. For in every embrace lay the future of the hall, the clan, the very line of the north. And when Freya and Freyr answered, their gifts were not only children, but the fire of life itself carried forward into saga and song. To ask what was sex really like in Viking times and more, is to also face the unspoken truth. Passion carried the weight of consequence. Every union might bring a new Viking child, and with it joy, labour, and another mouth to feed through the long dark winters. Not every family was ready for such burden, and so herbs and hope became weapons against fate. The Vikings knew that desire could not be denied, but it could be tempered, shaped by charms, draughts, and whispered practices passed from mother to daughter, healer to maiden. Women gathered plants beneath moonlight, muttering charms as they plucked them from the soil. Juniper berries, angelica root, and wild carrot seeds were steeped in bitter teas, drunk with hope that they might still the womb. Other remedies called for flax, soaked in strange mixtures, tucked into place as crude barriers. Some Viking women carried sprigs of mugwort, or wore amulets of bone carved with runes, believing the gods might guide their bodies as surely as they guided ships through storm seas. These methods were rarely certain, but in a world where every child could mean either strength or starvation, even the smallest chance was seized with desperate faith. Not all sought to prevent life. Some Viking couples, longing for children, turned to herbs, thought to stir fertility. Honey mixed with garlic, mead brewed with special roots, or baths scented with dill and fennel were believed to awaken the body's hidden fire. Charms were tied to bed frames, and prayers to Freya and Freya were spoken before the act. In such rituals, passion and piety were one, the bed itself an altar of flesh and fate. Fear of barrenness haunted many halls. A Viking woman who bore no sons might be pitied, whispered about, or cast aside for another bride. Healers offered her mixtures of animal organs, fish oils, and herbs, strange concoctions as much magic as medicine. Sometimes she was told to sit upon the bare earth, to let the strength of the soil seep into her, as though the land itself might lend her fertility. Others were told to lie beneath the full moon, arms outstretched, drawing down its light as a blessing for the womb. And yet, amid all the charms and herbs, the truth was harsh nature chose more than men or women could. Many children died before their first winter. Many women perished in childbirth despite every prayer. Herbs gave hope, but hope was frail against the weight of fate. Still, the Vikings clung to it, for to do otherwise was to surrender to despair. And so, in the smoky halls where Viking food was shared and Viking songs were sung, women brewed their bitter teas, men offered sacrifices, and both prayed that love might yield children, only when the gods themselves willed it so. To ask what was sex really like in Viking times and more, is to reckon with the truth that passion did not end with the embrace. Its weight often fell hardest on women, for the bed's warmth was followed by the fire of childbirth, a trial as dangerous as battle. If a Viking man earned honour with sword and shield, a Viking woman found hers in the ordeal of bearing life. Pregnancy was not only a burden, it was a sacred calling, and those who braved it were revered even as they faced death. When a woman's time drew near, the hall grew tense. Men stepped aside, for the work belonged to women alone. Midwives, often elder wives or widows with hard-won wisdom, took command. They carried with them not only herbs and cloths, but also the weight of countless births seen before. Runes were carved into bits of bone or wood, prayers whispered to Freya, goddess of love and fertility, who watched over the mother's struggle. Charms might be laid upon the bed, animal fat burned for protection, and water sprinkled as if to cleanse the chamber of lurking spirits. The birthing itself was raw and perilous. Without doctors, midwives relied on experience, instinct, and the courage of the mother. A Viking woman gritted her teeth through waves of pain, gripping the hands of kin as the midwife coaxed, guided, and sometimes cut or pulled with rough tools. Blood flowed, cries filled the hall, and all knew the mother walked the line between life and death. Many did not return from that crossing. The sagas are filled with warriors fallen in battle, yet just as many women fell in childbirth, their sacrifice no less profound. If the child came safely, joy burst through the hall like fire on dry wood. The newborn was sprinkled with water in a rite of acceptance, a first step into the clan's embrace. Kin gathered to hear the chosen name, often bound to ancestors or heroes, ensuring the child carried both legacy and hope. A Viking child was not only a gift, but a victory over fate, a sign that the family line endured. Yet, sorrow was never far. Some infants drew only a few breaths before silence claimed them, and some mothers never rose again from the birthing bed. In such moments, the midwife's hands could not turn the tide, and the hall was left with grief heavier than any weapon. Still, the people endured, for without mothers, there would be no future, no warriors, no singers of saga. Childbirth in the Viking world was both terror and triumph. It was a battlefield fought not with iron but with flesh, where midwives stood as shield maidens, and every cry of pain carried the promise of life. And when a woman survived, she bore not only her child, but the unspoken honour of one who had wrestled with death and returned. To ask what was sex really like in Viking times, and more, is to see that passion did not belong to men and women alone. The sagas, those woven tapestries of memory, hint at bonds between Viking men that went deeper than shared raids or sworn oaths. In a world where life was short and death often near, the closeness of brotherhood sometimes grew into something unspoken, carried in glances, laughter, and the warmth of firelit nights. The Viking hall was filled with men shoulder to shoulder, sleeping beneath the same furs after long days of toil or bloodshed. In the creak of ships and the storm of the sea, men leaned upon one another, their bodies pressed tight against the cold. To call it necessity was true, but there was more kinship that bordered on intimacy, a trust so profound it blurred the lines that others might guard. The sagas speak in riddles, never naming openly what could not be shouted, yet their verses carry whispers. Mocking poems accused rivals of lying at the feet of another man, and though often flung as insults, such words reveal that the thought itself was never far. Some Viking warriors may have sought comfort not only from women, but from the brothers who shared their battles. In those moments, the line between shame and solace was thin as a blade's edge. Among warriors, secrecy was shield and sword. A Viking man could face dishonor if branded unmanly, for strength and dominance shaped his place in the world. Yet, in the hidden dark, where only the gods bore witness, bonds could take forms never spoken in daylight. The god Loki himself mocked Odin for practicing womanly arts, and Thor for being deceived into wedding garb, proof that even the divine sagas danced upon the boundaries of masculinity and desire. Still, the brotherhood of men was not only about flesh. It was about devotion so fierce it could lead one warrior to die for another, to carve oaths into blood and honor that outlived their own bones. That kind of love, whether spoken in laughter or sealed in silence, was a truth of Viking life as much as swordplay or feasts of Viking food. In the end, the sagas leave us with shadows, hints, laughter, accusations, and verses sung with sly grins. Yet behind them lies a reality the people themselves may have known, but seldom confessed. That even in a harsh world ruled by law and blade, the bonds between Viking men could sometimes reach beyond brotherhood, crossing into the quiet realm of desire. To ask what was sex really like in Viking times and more, is to see not only the passion between men and women, but also the quiet fires that burned between women themselves. The sagas tell of shield maidens, of strong-willed wives, of widows who held estates with iron will. Viking women were no shadows in the hall. They were keepers of keys, bearers of honour, and in rare but telling whispers, companions of one another in ways that reached beyond friendship. The bonds between women were forged in both toil and battle. A Viking child clung to his mother, but a Viking woman leaned upon her sisters, whether bound by blood or choice. Shield maidens, who rode into war with sword and spear, shared more than steel. The sagas describe them standing side by side, oaths sworn to never yield, their devotion to one another as fierce as to any man. Within such closeness, one finds the suggestion of a different kind of love, one not bound by dowry or arranged marriage, but by choice. Poetry hints at it, slyly, as skalds crafted verses about maidens who lay long together. Tales from neighbouring lands spoke of women who cut their hair, donned armour, and took other women as companions. Though often framed as scandal or jest, these accounts reveal the possibility of affections hidden beneath the cloak of daily life. When Viking men sailed for seasons across the sea, the women who remained tended farms, shared furs through winter, and may have shared more. Yet, such desires lived in silence. To be branded unseemly risked laughter or shame, and so female same-sex bonds rarely emerged in the open sagas. Still, in the strength of their devotion, one can see glimmers. The love of one woman for another could be as fierce as a storm on the sea, cloaked not in bawdy jest, but in quiet loyalty. At times, the gods themselves gave shape to these possibilities. Freya, goddess of desire, knew no bounds in her affections, and in her worship, Viking women found a reflection of their own hearts, unconfined by law or marriage. Where fertility rituals were shared, where dances wound beneath moonlight, Perhaps bonds were sealed that no man's word could sever. Thus, while the sagas remain cautious, the silence itself speaks. Between shield maidens sworn to one another, wives left to guard the stead, and women whose devotion burned hotter than the hearth, there existed a sisterhood, unspoken yet unbroken. In the echoes of their laughter and the weight of their vows, the story of female intimacy lingers, a hidden thread in the vast tapestry of Viking life. To ask what was sex really like in Viking times, and more, is to step not only into the warmth of weddings and the laughter of halls, but also into the shadows where power and flesh were twisted together. Among the Viking people lived thralls, slaves taken in raids, born into bondage, or traded like cattle in the markets of Hedeby and Dublin. Their lives were not their own, and neither were their bodies. Intimacy in this world could be tender, but for the thrall, it was often survival. A Viking man of wealth might take a thrall woman to his bed as easily as he took a horn of mead, with no need for promise or ritual. Her silence was expected, her consent irrelevant. To bear his child meant the child too was a thrall, bound in chains of birth unless freed by grace or whim. Yet some sagas whisper of thrall women who used their closeness to powerful men as shield and weapon, carving out better fates for themselves or their children. In the harsh order of Viking law, even chains could be bent if one learned how to wield them. The story was no different for thrall men, who could be forced into service of the flesh by masters or mistresses alike. Such bonds were not honoured in song or memory, yet they existed in the dim corners of the longhouse, hidden from the verses of the skalds. What might be celebrated as love for a free Viking woman or man became silence and shame for those bound by servitude. Still, within this darkness lay sparks of endurance. Some thralls formed secret unions, holding one another in the quiet moments between toil. A Viking child born of such unions bore the mark of servitude, but also the hope that, through loyalty or luck, freedom might one day be won. There were masters who freed thralls they came to cherish, granting them place in the household not as servants but as kin. Yet such stories were rare, like light breaking through storm clouds. The sagas do not dwell long on this side of Viking life, for they were told by the free, not the bound. But the silence speaks as much as the words. Viking intimacy, for all its passion, poetry, and ritual, carried within it this darker thread, that desire, when chained to power, could strip away choice and turn bodies into tools of ownership. Thus, to speak of Viking love is to remember not only the feasts, the songs, and the marriages, but also the thralls who endured in silence. Their stories lie in the ashes of the hearth, unspoken yet vital, reminders that even in a world of honour and law, there was also bondage, and within it, the struggle to survive. To ask what was sex really like in Viking times and more, is to look not only at weddings and warmth, but also at betrayal and blood. Fidelity was prized, for it tied families together and bound oaths of land and legacy. Yet Viking men and women were as fiery in jealousy as they were in passion, and the sagas are thick with tales of faithless lovers, furious spouses, and vengeance carved in steel. For a Viking man, straying could be overlooked if his strength and wealth stood high, though whispers followed him like ravens on the wind. For a Viking woman, however, adultery was perilous. The law was sharp against her. To be caught lying with another meant dishonour, not just for her, but for her husband's entire household. Punishment could be exile, mutilation, or in the harshest cases, death. Still, the sagas speak of daring women who risked it all, slipping into the arms of lovers when their husbands were at sea, hiding desire in shadows and stolen glances. The lawmen, keepers of Viking order, cared less for passion than for property. Adultery threatened inheritance, the rightful line of sons and daughters. Thus, a husband wronged might bring his wife and her lover before the thing, demanding justice. The crowd could decide their fate, and often the shame itself was punishment enough. Yet there are stories where wronged husbands swung axe or sword before law could speak, ending the matter with blood pooling on the ground. But not all Viking women were silent victims. A slighted wife might poison her rival's food, set fire to her husband's bed, or call upon her kin to avenge her honour. The sagas tell of women who turned their husband's infidelity into war, pitting clans against each other for generations. What began as a tryst beneath the thatch could end with villages burning by the fjord. Jealousy was a storm that could not be quelled easily. Viking poetry, with all its wit and bite, often mocked the faithless, painting them as weak or dishonourable. A Viking child would hear these verses at the hearth, learning that loyalty in love was as sacred as loyalty in battle. Yet, as always, desire pushed against the walls of law. Men took concubines, women stole moments with forbidden lovers, and in the clash of law and longing, sagas were born. Thus, adultery in the Viking world was not a simple matter of passion. It was a breach of honour, a tearing of kinship threads, and often a spark that lit the flames of vengeance. Fidelity was strength, but faithlessness could be deadly. In this lay the danger of Viking love, that in breaking trust, one risked not only shame, but the blade. To ask what was sex really like in Viking times, and more, is to open a door not only to passion and marriage, but also to shadows where bloodline and desire tangled into scandal. Among the Viking people, kinship was sacred blood, carried honour, inheritance, and the memory of gods themselves. Yet the closeness of clans, bound in tight villages and longhouses, sometimes stirred whispers of forbidden intimacy. Incest was no light matter in the Viking world. The sagas speak of it as a stain, a breach that could bring ruin upon families. Cousins too near, siblings bound in secret, even step-kin who crossed the line, all were spoken of with dread. The law of the thing condemned such unions, not merely for morality, but for the danger it posed to inheritance and the weaving of alliances. A Viking man who lay with a close kinswoman risked not only scorn, but outlawry, stripped of his rights and hunted like a wolf. Yet scandal lived in the sagas, and the poets did not shy from weaving its fire. In Njál's saga and others, men hurled insults of kin-bedding at rivals, even when untrue, for the shame alone could wound deeper than a blade. A Viking woman accused of incest bore dishonour heavy as iron, her children whispered about as tainted, unfit to inherit lands or lead men into battle. To be marked with such sin was to be cast outside the Hall of Honour. Still, behind law and shame, temptation stirred. The longhouses were crowded, furs shared, and lives entwined. A Viking child grew beside cousins and kin, bonds strong as oak, yet at times bending under the strain of forbidden longing. The gods themselves were not free of such shadows. Odin and his kin walked tangled paths of blood, and mortals, in following them, sometimes blurred the line between sacred myth and human sin. The punishment for incest could be brutal. Outlawry stripped a man of all safety, forcing him into the wild to starve or fall to wolves. A woman might be driven from her household, left to wander as beggar or slave. In harsher whispers, some say death itself was dealt quietly, a stain wiped away by steel, rather than allowed to linger on a family's name. Yet even in condemnation, the sagas remind us that incest was more than sin. It was fear of broken order. Bloodlines were the backbone of the Viking world. They carried claims to land, to wealth, to the very right of ruling. To blur them was to weaken not only a family, but the whole weave of kinship. Thus, the scandal of incest, though rarely spoken aloud, haunted the edge of Viking halls. It was a taboo born not only of desire gone astray, but of the terror that such desire could unmake the very bonds on which the Viking world stood. When one asks what was sex really like in Viking times and more, the answer cannot remain only within the walls of the longhouse, for the Viking man was seldom bound to his hearth alone. The world beyond the fjords offered not only silver and plunder, but temptations of flesh and desire that carried their own stories. Foreign temptations followed the prow of the dragon ship, as surely as the spray of the sea. Across the coasts of Ireland and Francia, Viking warriors found women taken as thralls in raids, wives of slain men, daughters of noble houses, and peasant girls alike. To the Viking, these women became both spoils and companions, some kept as concubines, others folded unwillingly into households far from their native lands. Such bonds were built on power and survival, not the warmth of kinship. Yet in some sagas, the children of these unions rose to claim names and lands, living proof that conquest and desire walked hand in hand. But the lure of foreign lands was not always forced. In markets of Constantinople, Viking merchants called Varangians drank wine beside dark-eyed women whose laughter promised secrets sweeter than silver. They brought back tales of silk-clad lovers in the east, of baths scented with oils, and of beds where the customs of foreign courts unravelled Viking restraint. These were not mere flings of passion, but encounters that marked the Norse imagination with hunger for the exotic and strange. The Viking woman, too, was not blind to such paths. Saga whispers tell of Norse wives left at home, only to hear of husbands with concubines in the east, their fury sharp as any sword when those men returned. Jealousy stoked fires in longhouses, yet pragmatism often tempered rage. A Viking wife might accept a thrall-born child if it secured labour and loyalty for the farm, though the sting of betrayal never dulled entirely. Foreign temptations also carried peril. A Viking man might take a lover in distant lands only to face betrayal, ambush, or poison. Some sagas sing of heroes undone not by battle, but by the embrace of women who whispered false promises. To lie with a foreign woman could be both pleasure and risk, a gamble as dangerous as storm seas. Still, it was through such unions, both dark and tender, that the Viking world grew beyond its own borders. Bloodlines blended, tongues mixed, and children born of conquest or affection tied the Norse to lands far beyond the fjords. What was sex in Viking times if not both hearth and horizon, intimacy and ambition? In the bed of the foreign lover, as in the clash of shield and sword, the Viking carved another path into the saga of the world. When one asks what was sex really like in Viking times and more, the answers turn not only to weddings and sagas, but also to the dim corners of trade towns and harbours where silver crossed palms for fleeting warmth. Though the Vikings left no grand halls dedicated to such trade, their bustling ports, Birka, Hedeby, Kaupang, swelled with merchants, sailors, and wanderers who carried both hunger and coin. Where men gathered, women soon followed, and from this grew the shadowed trade of flesh. In the creaking inns by the water's edge, a Viking man might find harbour women who offered more than ale. These women were often thralls freed for survival, widows who could not feed themselves by spinning or weaving, or wanderers drawn by the promise of coin. Their bodies became currency in places where trade was fierce and silver spoke louder than honour. A few did so by choice, cloaking necessity in skill, learning how to tease coin from warriors boasting of raids and journeys. The sagas whisper little of brothels, yet archaeology and lore hint at gatherings where the line between tavern and bedchamber blurred. A Viking traveller who came seeking furs, salt, or amber might leave with the scent of sweat and perfume on his cloak, the memory of a fleeting embrace bought with clipped silver. Such liaisons were practical, transactional, stripped of romance, yet heavy with survival's truth. The church, when it came north, railed against such dealings, calling them sin and ruin, but the Viking world measured life differently. To a merchant at sea for months, to a thrall woman needing food for her Viking child, such exchanges were neither sacred nor shameful. They were simply another form of trade, as common as weighing silver or bartering hides. Yet there was danger woven through. A man could wake with his purse gone, poisoned by wine, or shamed if a rival mocked his indulgence. A woman could be cast aside, beaten, or claimed by force if her protector failed her. These shadows gave the harbour's pleasures an edge sharper than any blade. Still, The brothels of the north, if they may be called, such were more than flesh alone. They were places where gossip flowed freer than mead, where ships' secrets passed from pillow to pillow, and where the threads of trade and desire tangled together. Foreign tongues, Viking laughter, women's whispers here lay another side of Norse life, half hidden, half accepted. What was sex really like in Viking times, and more? Not only the union of bride and groom beneath kin's watchful eyes, but also the quick embrace behind an alehouse door, the glint of silver on a straw pallet, the survival of women and the indulgence of men. In those smoky dens, the pulse of the north beat as fiercely as in the halls of kings. The allure of flesh in the north was never just in the curve of the body or the heat of the hearth. It was in the scent of clean skin after a cold plunge, the gleam of hair washed in lye, the freshness of a Viking man who had rinsed the salt of the sea from his beard. For the people of the longhouse, the bath and the bed were not far apart, for desire was stirred as much by cleanliness as by hunger. Vikings, unlike many of their neighbours, cherished the ritual of bathing. Streams, fjords, and rivers became chambers of renewal, where men and women slipped into cold waters that bit the flesh and sharpened the breath. On the day of bathing, a Viking woman might gather herbs to scent her hair, while her hands scrubbed away the smoke of the hearth and the toil of labour. Men, too, took pride in it, combing long locks, braiding beards, smoothing oils into their skin. This care was not vanity alone. It was the currency of attraction, the silent invitation when eyes met across the firelit hall. It was said by foreigners that Viking men bathed once a week, far more often than many in Christendom, and that this habit won them favour in the eyes of women abroad. To lie beside a partner whose skin smelled of pine soap rather than stale sweat was itself a kind of seduction. Cleanliness was not just survival against sickness, it was a weapon of desire, as sharp as any sword. In the bed, this ritual bore fruit. After the harsh sting of icy rivers, bodies pressed together under heavy furs burned hotter, skin to skin. The memory of water on flesh lingered, making the union more vivid, more alive. For a Viking child conceived in such a moment, the first breath of life was tied to both the wild river and the warmth of the bed. The hall itself echoed with this awareness. Laughter followed when a Viking youth returned from bathing, hair dripping, cheeks flushed, eyes searching the benches for the maiden who had caught his thoughts. The elders knew well the stirrings of attraction, and let the fire carry its song, for the bed awaited, once law and kin permitted. Cleanliness, then, was not mere habit, but a path to intimacy. The Viking woman who combed her hair until it shone like the sea at dawn, or the Viking man who slipped into the water before feast and song, both carried in their care the silent promise of desire. The bath fed the bed, and the bed renewed the cycle of life, weaving passion into the very fabric of survival. Desire in the north was not always left to the strength of flesh or the warmth of a Viking bed. It was often bound by whispers, by charms, and by powers that lingered in the unseen. In the hush of the longhouse, a woman might trace runes into wood or mutter words over a cup of mead, stirring more than drink. Love and lust were not always trusted to chance. They could be swayed by seether, the magic of the Norse, dangerous and alluring in equal measure. A Viking man who found his heart stolen might blame not the maiden's smile, but a spell woven in secret. Seither, practised most often by women, was feared for the hold it could place upon men. It was said that herbs gathered under moonlight could stir lust like a storm wind, and charms knotted into hair or cloth could keep a lover faithful or curse him with wandering need. The bedchamber was not just a place of skin upon skin, but a battlefield of unseen forces. Men, too, were known to dabble in such arts, though suspicion followed them. To wield seither was to invite whispers of unmanliness, for the craft was thought a woman's power. Yet sagas tell of those who risked shame, weaving spells of desire, calling upon Freya or Freyr to bend another's will. In such tales, lust became both gift and curse, a fire that could consume families, kindle feuds, or even topple a chieftain's hall. Accusations of sorcery were as sharp as any axe. A Viking woman who bore many lovers, or who kept her husband's passion when others waned, might find jealous tongues naming her a witch. The punishment could be exile or worse, yet the belief endured that in the night, beyond the sight of kin, desire could be conjured. Still, there was reverence in the fear. To think that a Viking child might be born of love, bound not only by flesh, but by spell, gave weight to such unions. The gods themselves were said to answer these charms. Freya, goddess of love and lust, lent her power to those who whispered to her, while Odin, who sought wisdom in all forms, was said to have tasted the arts of Seither despite the scorn it brought. In the bedchamber, then, magic was never far. A glance held too long, a gift of herbs, a song murmured before lying down, each carried the shadow of enchantment. Desire was not only a matter of heat and hunger, but of power, of fear, of unseen threads, binding Viking lovers closer or tearing them apart. Few wounds cut deeper in the Viking world than those carved not by axe or spear, but by tongue. To a Viking man, his honour was his shield, and shame was a wound that festered beyond healing. Public insults, spoken in the smoke of the longhouse, or shouted across the Thing assembly, could strip a warrior bare, unmaking his reputation before the eyes of kin and foe alike. The art of flighting, that sharp duel of words, was more feared than steel by some. A Viking skald could weave insult with venom, painting a man as weak, unfaithful, or unmanly, and once the words took root, they were near impossible to uproot. To be accused of cowardice in bed, of failing one's wife, or of taking the passive role with another man, was not mere jest. It was a stain that clung to a man's name, his children, his line. A Viking child might grow beneath the shadow of a father's shame, mocked before he could even raise a sword. For women too, scorn was a weapon. A Viking wife accused of betrayal might find herself shorn of hair, her body mocked in verse, her worth dismissed in public view. Jealous rivals or spurned lovers could speak her downfall into the sagas with little more than a biting rhyme. To call a woman faithless was to strip her family of pride, and in some halls it brought vengeance, swift and bloody. Yet flighting was more than cruelty, it was spectacle. The longhouse roared when men exchanged biting lines, when Viking food and drink loosened tongues and courage, when warriors tested not only their swords, but their wit. Still, beneath the laughter, all knew the cost of such games. A word too sharp could spark a duel, a feud, or blood upon the hall floor. Unmanliness was the darkest mark of all. In a world where strength and virility bound a man to his kin and his gods, to be called weak in desire or timid in war was ruin. Many a saga tells of men who risked everything to erase such insults, cutting down rivals in open combat simply to prove what no verse could deny. Scorn and shame lived long in Viking memory. A verse of insult could outlast the tallest burial mound, carried on the lips of skalds and whispered at winter fires. Honour was life itself, and when it was broken, even the strongest Viking man might find himself crushed beneath the weight of words sharper than iron. Love in the sagas was never soft or simple. It was fire bound with iron, a force as fierce as any Viking storm. The tales of Gudrun and Brynhild, of men and women caught between passion and oath, sang through the halls long after the warriors who lived them lay in their graves. These were not quiet romances whispered in shadows, but loves that split kingdoms, drowned in blood, and echoed through generations like the crash of the sea against the fjords. Gudrun, daughter of Juki, stood as one of the most tragic figures. Given in marriage to Sigurd the dragon slayer, she tasted joy only to watch it crumble. Through treachery and sorcery, Brynhild, proud shield maiden and lover of Sigurd, was deceived, believing herself betrayed. What followed was no simple quarrel of women, but the unravelling of whole houses. A Viking woman wronged could wield fury sharper than steel, and Brynhild's wrath brought ruin. Sigurd's death, Gudrun's grief, and the red spilling of kin upon kin. The sagas never painted love as gentle. It was a battle in its own right. A Viking man might ride for honour, but often it was desire that spurred the sword arm, pulling him into feuds where bloodline and fate were knotted beyond breaking. Women, too, bore this fire. They were not meek brides, but fierce weavers of destiny, whose words could drive warriors to kill or to wed, to burn kingdoms or to bind them in fragile peace. Brynhild's own death, casting herself upon the flames beside Sigurd, is told not as weakness, but as the defiance of one who would not live diminished. Viking children grew hearing such tales, where love was no hearthside comfort, but a force as mighty and consuming as war. The sagas made clear, love was not apart from fate, but tangled in it. A glance across a hall, a whispered vow, a promise bound in mead and silver, these were never small things. They could shape kingdoms, tear apart clans, or be sung for centuries in the verses of skalds. To the Viking heart, romance was not merely longing, it was destiny's snare. And in that snare, lovers burned bright, sometimes too bright, leaving behind sagas that outlived their bones, teaching that passion, like the sword, carved its own path through the world. The old gods had once smiled upon the union of man and woman, upon the spilling of seed in fields and in bed alike, for life was sacred wherever it took root. In the age before the cross, a Viking man might carve runes on a bedpost to call on Freya, while a Viking woman might lay flowers to Freya for strength in the womb. Fertility was a blessing, desire a gift, and passion, though fierce, was never marked with shame. But as the white Christ crept across the north, the song of love was rewritten into whispers of sin. The first priests who came to the fjords recoiled at what they saw. Festivals of spring, where men and women danced with loosened bonds, charms woven into girdles, and fires leaping as couples leapt with them. To the Christian eye these were abominations, but to the Viking heart they had been lifeblood, ensuring children, crops, and the turning of seasons. Slowly, through word and sword, these rituals were branded heathen, and what had once been proud became hidden in shadow. The mead halls still rang with laughter, yet new fear seeped in. A Viking man accused of adultery could now be called not only faithless, but damned. A Viking woman, who once prayed openly for fertile loins, now bowed in confession, her body spoken of as temptation, her desire called sin. Where once desire had been met with skaldic verse and bawdy riddles, it was now hushed behind church walls, bound by laws not of kin but of scripture. Yet change was never swift. Many clung to the old ways in secret. Midwives still whispered charms as they tied knots above birthing beds. Farmers still left a sheaf in the field for Freya's blessing. Lovers still sought hidden moments by the fire, though now they bore the weight of watching eyes. The Viking child grew in a world torn between two faiths, between the laughter of sagas and the solemn toll of the church bell. In time, the sagas themselves began to bend. Skalds sang less of Freya's passion and more of holy unions before God. Where once the gods had demanded life and fire, now the cross demanded silence and obedience. The transformation was not only of worship, but of flesh and heart. Thus the North turned, from a world where love was power, raw and unashamed, to one where it was chained in secrecy, judged by priests, and weighed against heaven and hell. Yet beneath the cloak of piety, the old fire smouldered still, for no sermon could quench what burned in the Viking spirit, the hunger to love, to live, and to defy. When the feasting fires had long gone cold, and the oars of dragon ships lay rotting beneath the earth, what endured were the tales. The sagas, carved first upon memory, and later upon parchment, carried with them not just the blood of battle, but the pulse of the heart. Love, in all its fury and tenderness, was stitched into the same cloth as war and fate. A Viking man might be remembered for his sword stroke, yet his longing for a woman, or his betrayal of her, could weigh as heavily upon his legacy as the clash of steel. Through these stories, desire was never forgotten. Gudrun's grief, Brynhild's vengeance, the forbidden trysts whispered of in smoky halls, such tales lived beyond their time, shaping how generations understood passion and peril. A Viking woman was not merely a prize of marriage contracts, but a voice of sorrow, cunning, or wrath whose choices could unravel kingdoms. Her love might kindle loyalty or ignite blood feuds, proving that the bonds of the heart could be as binding as oaths sworn before gods. Marriage, too, was remembered not as cold transaction alone, but as a union woven with feasts, sacred swords, and the laughter of kin. The wedding night bedding, the sharing of ale, the rituals of hearth and hand, all were preserved in verse, carrying echoes of both joy and solemnity. The Viking child, born of such unions, stood as living proof of these passions, carrying onward bloodlines that had once been bargained in smoky halls, yet sealed in moments of fire and flesh. Even desire, though hushed by the church, remained in memory like embers beneath ash. Skaldic verse, rich with riddles and sly wit, preserved the hunger of men and women who once spoke boldly of flesh and need. In saga, these whispers were transformed into poetry, laughter, or tragedy, yet never erased. The Viking spirit refused to let passion be wholly silenced, keeping it alive in the rhythm of story, where shame could not bind it. Thus, when we peer into those ancient texts, we glimpse more than battles and kings. We see the tender hand of a Viking mother brushing the brow of her child, the fierce loyalty of a husband avenging his bride, the sorrow of a maiden betrayed. Love in saga memory was no soft afterthought, it was storm and flame, equal to spear and shield. And so, though centuries have passed, the heart of the North still beats in these tales, where passion lingers like mead upon the tongue, and desire burns eternal in the words of the skalds.